As you may have heard, and you have got the flyer about who the speaker is, so let me say a few words about him. Dr. Lauth is a very distinguished graduate of the Maxwell School. He was here in the 1960s. And then again in the 1970s, he got his Ph.D. from this program. He got out of this place in 1976 with a Ph.D. and for his Ph.D. degree, he worked with several big names in the history of the Maxwell School. And after that, he has been in the state of Georgia, first at the state of Georgia State University a few years, and then moved on to the University of Georgia. After that, he has been at a place for a few years as the director of the PhD program, then the department head of the political science department. And as soon as University of Georgia created its School of Public and International Affairs, Dr. Lauth was the founding dean till just last year. He served for over a dozen years, almost 2,000 years, as the department head, and then the founding dean for 10 or 11 years. So he has a very, he is the author, co-author, or editor of several quite a few books and quite a few dozen academic journal articles. So he is a very well-known internationally and in this country scholar in public budgeting, public finance, and also he is a distinguished academic leader at the different levels. And also he has served on quite a few national and sometimes international association societies. So he knows quite a lot about budgeting, finance, and beyond that, leadership, which is quite relevant to you. So this is the first in the series of lectures that we have designed and launched for you guys in particular. All right, so without much ado, let's welcome Dr. Lauth.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ho. Is this microphone working well enough that you can hear me? Thumbs up means yes, I guess. It's fun to be back at the Maxwell School. I was saying yesterday when I came by, when I was here, probably close to 50 years ago, this was the Maxwell Library. Maybe hard for you to imagine, but this is where many of us studied with books lined on all of the walls. So it's interesting to be back in this room after so many years. Professor Ho asked me to come and talk a bit about budgeting. That's all the direction he gave me. He said, told me roughly who you were, but I understand that at least some of you have taken formal courses in government budgeting and finance, but many have not, or have not yet reached that stage in the program. But that all of you have experience as leaders in respective organizations, and so what I thought I would do today is to share with you 6 ideas about a public budget, and to leave a fair amount of time for questions and answers. As we go along, if there's something that occurs to you that you just can't contain asking about, I'm fairly easy. I'll take questions as they come. But 6 ideas that I want to talk about. The first notion is to say to you that a public budget is a technique for allocating scarce resources among competing governmental agencies and programs and activities. And let me unpack that a bit. And to say that the first element that is there is that we tend to budget by organizational units sometimes, by program elements, and that appropriations can be either lump sum or by object of expenditure classification. And sometimes we budget both to organizational units and to programs that are embedded within organizational units. Historically, we budgeted to organizational units. As the field became more sophisticated and more developed, we thought that it made more sense to budget by program elements. A lot of budgeting systems across the states in the United States are hybrids of both program elements and organizational units. Sometimes we budget to very specific objects of expenditure. Lump sum appropriations tend to be in fairly broad categories. That's especially true in program elements of the U.S. federal government, but in state governments, for example, where I've done most of my work, a lump sum budget would be to personnel, operating, and capital, perhaps. As the system becomes more advanced and more sophisticated, we might develop a set of a dozen or so object classifications that are common to all units across the government, and some that are specific and unique to some units of the government. And so this is a fairly fundamental notion about how we organize budgets. What I really want to talk to you guys about, though, with regard to this first point, is to argue that essentially resources are almost always scarce. And they're scarce sometimes because of the conditions of the economy. They're scarce sometimes because our system for claiming the resources, the tax system, operates inefficiently and doesn't claim resources adequately. But they're also scarce, and perhaps this is my most important point, because we have different ideological preferences for the size and the role of government. And it seems to me that leadership includes defining the appropriate balance of personal and corporate income that we would claim for public purposes, on the one hand, and the amount of personal and corporate income that we would permit individuals to retain for consumption, for saving, or for investment and capital expansion. If there is an issue in the United States that generates more heat in this field, it is this distinction. It differentiates Republicans and Democrats from each other. It differentiates liberals and conservatives from each other. It differentiates those that have a preference for a command economy from those who have a preference for a market economy. And those are not mutually exclusive distinctions. There are many ways, different ways of characterizing the same thing: liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, market-based or command economy, and the like. But it seems to me the role of the leader in this regard is to understand what those issues are, maybe to perceive accurately what the community thinks about those questions, and then, after having made a determination as to what the appropriate balance ought to be able to effectively articulate the balance and to effectively articulate the rationale for the balance. In a conservative state government like my own state, Governor needs to understand that the citizens are fairly conservative about what they think the role of government ought to be. They think the government ought to be relatively small. They think the government ought not to claim very many of their resources, that ought to allow them to retain their resources for spending on consumer products, for investment, rather than to have the government claim large amounts of resources. In other states, somewhat different kinds of perceptions. But it seems to me that the role of a leader in this connection is to understand this basic issue about scarcity. I think unsuccessful leaders are probably people who don't get it right. And then once having understood it, are not skillful in communicating the rationale and to communicate their own position on these questions. So, you know, the point then is that a budget is a way for allocating scarce resources among competing agencies and programs and activities, with at least some emphasis on scarcity and what that's about. It's not just an economic term, it seems to me. In public finance, it's a philosophic term and an ideological term as well. So, point number one. So far, so good? Yes, sir.
Is there any shift in any of the states or city governments towards moving from line item budgeting to outcome budgeting?
Yes, a lot. I'm going to talk a lot. I'll be talking specifically about that in a little while. The answer is yes. Of course, there is. Is that a good enough answer until we get to that point, and we can deal with it? Okay. But yes, there is some of that. The second proposition is that a public budget is a statement of the relationship between proposed expenditures and anticipated revenues. Question is, what should that relationship be? I mean, this is sort of a statement about what it is. The United States government does not have a balanced budget requirement. And indeed, there are some of us who think that that would be a bad idea. Reasonable people and some who are not so reasonable disagree about that. But I think one can make the argument that it would not be a good idea for the government to have a balanced budget requirement. That does not mean, however, that people aren't concerned about deficits and debt. That we're considerably concerned about the size of the deficit and the size of the debt. And just some evidence of the alarm that we have here, if one looks at deficit figures and debt figures for the United States, you would notice that we had a declining deficit up to about the onset of the Great Recession, and then a fairly substantial increase in the deficit. We had a period beginning in the Clinton administration in which the size of the deficit declined or the size of the surplus increased for 8 consecutive years. That's probably one of the big reasons why, after the House of Representatives impeached President Clinton, the Senate did not convict him. The American people said, we don't like the bad behavior of this guy, but the economy sure is good, and there isn't any reason for us to make a change. But we are now faced with a situation where, in the years immediately following the Great Recession, the size of the deficit of the government of the United States had reached $1 trillion. It's now headed back in the other direction. We, in the outcome of the Great Recession, had a debt as a percentage of GDP that had moved from about 33% to approximately 77%. These are scary and not tolerable kinds of figures. So to argue that it's not necessarily a good idea to have a balanced budget requirement is not the same thing as saying we ought not be concerned about deficits and debt. Nearly all of the state governments in the United States have a balanced budget requirement, either constitutional or statutory. But that doesn't mean that state budgets are always balanced either. Most of the time they are, some are not. My own state of Georgia adheres pretty closely to having a balanced budget. But there have been examples in recent times of states like Illinois or California that have budgets that have been wildly out of balance. So there's a fairly broad range. And so my argument here is that what probably keeps budgets in balance is not only a statutory or constitutional requirement, but it's a political culture value that places a high priority on having a balanced a budget. And I would argue for you that leadership is an essential ingredient in enforcing this cultural value. Governors, other leaders in state government that understand this value have an obligation, it seems to me, to articulate it. Still good? Yes, again.
Yeah. Does a balanced budget mean that the proposed expenditure will not be more than the estimated revenues?
The expenditure will not be more than
Estimated revenues?
I'm not miss.
Should not be more than estimated revenue.
Estimated revenues. Yeah, that's more or less what it means. The budget of the United States almost always is planned to be out of balance. And in order to meet the difference between estimated revenues and planned expenditures, the government borrows. I mean, that's where the debt comes from. And that's what the deficit is. The deficit in a particular year is the planned difference between estimated revenues and planned expenditures, and as that accumulates, it contributes to the deficit. Now, why does that happen? It's not that we just don't get the arithmetic right. It's that as a society, our appetite for spending is greater than our tolerance for taxation. We don't want to have a level of taxation that would be sufficient to meet our appetite for expenditures. And so to some extent, people are a bit ignorant about that on a day-to-day basis until it becomes wildly out of balance. And then when it becomes wildly out of balance, we get concerned about it. And I think that's sort of what happens.
But as you said, in most of the states, it's a constitutional or a statutory requirement that the budget should be balanced.
Right.
So how is it that in case, when it comes to federal budget, people don't have that tolerance for taxes and have more appetite for spending? But when it comes to the state budget, it becomes a political cultural value.
Right.
And people expect the state budgets to be balanced.
Yeah. Well, I think that there are some people that would think that the budget of the United States ought to be balanced and be required to be balanced. But I think that sort of the policy-making elites that probably are more influential in this question would essentially argue that it's a bad idea to have a balanced budget requirement because then it does not permit you to engage in counter-cyclical activities that would be important to try to keep your economy in balance, to smooth out perturbations in the business cycle. I think is essentially the argument. But your question is, why is it that this same cultural value that you have in individual states doesn't permeate the entire United States? And I think there are just differences, and people have different expectations about their government. But that's a perceptive question. I understand. Okay.
Maybe the state governments do not have the right to print.
Do they have a right to?
They don't have the right to the possibility of printing.
No, they don't. They do not.
That is the reason that they.
No, they don't. That may be a factor. I mean, the U.S. government can, yeah, it can. I mean, it can, but I don't think there's the expectation at the state level that the states will engage in counter-cyclical activity as well. I mean, states probably engage in some counter-cyclical activity. I think in the way in which we allocate education spending among the school districts, local school districts, has some counter-cyclical effect. But generally speaking, states can't manage the externalities to nearly the same degree that would be necessary to make that work, I think.
You just mentioned about this. There is a 77% of this deficit. So, is there any threshold limit for this? For this deficit?
Is there a limit?
Yeah. Is there any
No.
limit, or we can just go?
There's probably a political limit, but there is no statutory limit. But bear in mind, I think there's a general view that smaller deficit or no deficit is better than big deficit. But there are certain circumstances, and when I get to my sixth point, you'll see there are certain circumstances where it's necessary to increase the size of the deficit. Let me move on. I don't want to make my handlers nervous. A budget's a record of past performance, and it's a plan for future action. Probably quite obvious to you that it's a plan for future action. Budgeting is about planning for future spending. But my argument here is that budgets include not just proposals for new spending, but they also record the record of past spending. And typically in a budget document, that would show past spending for maybe 2 or 3 previous fiscal years. But the budgetary base is in many ways a multi-year record of all past spending decisions. I mean, if you think about that. When policy questions get resolved and funding gets allocated to them, that gets embedded in the budget. And the budget for the next year begins with that base level of spending. And unless we make a conscious decision to reduce spending for those programs as we move forward, new spending decisions get aggregated on top of past spending decisions. And in that sense, I think the budget has an incremental characteristic, with the future decisions being incremented on in the past. The middle point is a quick one. The U.S. budget is annual. Most state budgets are annual, but some of them are biennial. The last point is that program budgets sometimes project spending over a multi-year horizon. That's probably particularly true in the United States in the area of defense spending. And leadership becomes very, very important in those kinds of projections. okay? The fourth proposition is to argue that a budget is an instrument for legislative control of the executive branch. It's also a device through which the chief executive attempts to control and direct agencies within the executive branch and to provide some fiscal leadership for the legislature. Now, this is very US-centric because it talks about separation of powers. If you come from a political system that has a fusion of powers and not a separation of powers, you would have to sort of extrapolate this a little bit in understanding it. But let's unpack it a bit. We have historically granted authority for taxing and spending to the most populous branch of government, to the legislature. You know, the thinking is that among the things that government can do not only for you, but to you, is to claim your gold. That is to claim your wealth. And if the government is going to impose a tax on you, that it ought to be done by that branch of government that is in some ways the closest to the people, the legislative branch. In contrast to the executive branch that sort of smacks of history of the king claiming your wealth. So that's why in this country at least we have said that all bills proposing to raise revenue must begin in the legislative branch, and more particularly in the most populous branch on the legislative side, typically a House of Representatives. And by tradition, we have extended that to bills proposing to spend, appropriations bills as well, although the Constitution only requires it for taxing bills. Historically, legislatures received estimates of expenditures from executive branch agencies. And that worked for a while when the government was fairly simple, when the level of spending that was in play was maybe relatively small. But as the level of spending increased, as the number of functions and programs became more complicated and more complex, there needed to be a mechanism that would help the legislature to sort of sort through these claims of spending. And this eventually led to legislature saying, we are going to grant to the executive branch a responsibility for central clearance of agency requests for spending, and also charge the executive branch or the chief executive with responsibility for controlling and directing the way in which agencies requested money, and also controlling and directing the way in which they spent their money. And one of the hallmarks, I think, of an executive budget system is the institutional apparatus that we developed to achieve this. And here I mention a central budget unit that reports directly to the chief executive, to the governor, to the mayor, to the president, that reports directly, that has a professionally trained staff, that has the capability to understand financial issues and also to perform analytical tasks. And perhaps most importantly, to serve as an advocate for the policy preferences of the chief executive. If the chief executive uses the budget, that is, uses what policies she is willing to approve, and enforces what standards of performance she requires, that's a central element of a executive budget system. And over the years, we've developed such a budget system at our national level and also in state governments as well. I say that the president and governors use their budgets as major agenda-setting statements. And in this, what did I do? Something I shouldn't have done, I think. Help. It's right behind it, so I guess we just need to take that one out. That'll do it, I hope. Thank you. Oh. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. In my state, in the 1990s, we had a governor that faced a recession just as he was coming into office. And he had some plans for policy innovation. He wanted to increase spending for teacher salaries. He wanted to enlarge some prisons. And he wanted to remove the sales tax from food that was used for at-home consumption, presumably to remove some of the inequity in the sales tax. But facing a recession, revenue growth was slow. And so he developed a technique, along with his budget director, known as budget redirection. It said essentially to agencies, we want you to identify an amount in your base budget equal to 5% of your budget and lay it on the table. And by definition, this will represent the lowest priorities in your agency. And the Central Budget Office then will make a decision to maybe allow you to keep it to fund your requests for new program initiatives, but maybe not. May take it and allocate it to fund new program initiatives of another agency. Or a third alternative would be to capture it centrally to fund the policy initiatives of the governor. Initially, department heads didn't think he was serious. This seems like a pretty radical innovation in the budget process. And so what the agency submitted to the Central Budget Office didn't comport or to comply with the 5% requirement. I'm told that the governor let his temper show, had a Saturday morning meeting at the governor's mansion, to which all agency heads were required in attendance, and told them in very direct terms that he was serious, and that if they didn't comply, it probably would cost them their jobs. Agencies then concluded more or less that he was serious, and they began to comply. What we know from the research that we've done on this is that in the first year, agencies were able to retain about 2/3 of the money that they actually laid on the table. They pretty much lost about a third. That's not a third of the budget, that's a third of the 5%. And that in the second and third year, they were able to retain a bit of a higher percentage, about 88%. But this was sufficient to allow the governor to provide a salary pool to increase the salary of state teachers, university professors, pool of about 6% per year for 4 consecutive years, to expand prisons, literally buy new prison beds. I always thought that was an interesting kind of way of putting it. To think about prison expansion as economic development. And the third thing was to reduce the sales tax, which was at 4%, to reduce it in year 1 from 4 to 2, in year 2 from 2 to 1, and in year 3 from 1 to 0, and to remove the sales tax on food for at home consumption. This is a very, I think, excellent example of using the budget as a leadership tool by a governor of a state. Faced with a constricted economy, a very clever innovation. And if you ever want to read anything about it, in a piece that his budget director and I published in 1998, it's sort of detailed treatment of that particular task. Number 5 is that budgeting, a public budget, I think, is a mechanism for accountability in the management of public funds. And here I think accountability for me has two meanings. There's the obvious meaning of sort of financial fiduciary responsibility. Making sure the money is accounted for, that the books balance. This is a very important kind of accountability function. But in this context, I mean something a bit broader regarding accountability. When we talk about budget reform, we generally are talking about two different kinds of things. We're talking about changing institutional relationships. And that first point, I sort of just want to get you to see it and then to move it out of the way. To restructure institutional relationships. And secondly, to introduce additional kinds of information into the budget process. The institutional changes, of course, would be creating an executive budget, in the federal level, increasing the capacity of the Congress, which we did in the middle 1970s with the Congressional Budget Act. But this is what I want to focus on. Rational budgeting reforms of the 1950s and 60s and 70s focused primarily on interjecting program, planning, and performance information into the process of making resource allocation decisions. Figuratively, what we're saying is that on this table, where we're going to make decisions about allocating resources, we're going to have two different kinds of numbers. One set of numbers are dollars. The other set of numbers are performance metrics. About program performance, about individual performance, and that we are going to use the performance metrics to try to influence the way in which we allocate the dollars. And so accountability in the broader sense, or in this sense, means that in those decades, and certainly up to the present time, that there's been a lot of emphasis, and I think this goes to your question that you asked earlier, in governments to try to introduce program planning, performance information. In the early days, it was about efficiency. That is the production function by which we did the work, to make it managerially, to make the process more efficient. Later, it became not just about making the process efficient, but attempting to measure whether or not the outcomes were more effective. That's obviously a much more difficult kind of measurement, but certainly the effort was there. At the federal level, it was in the form of the Government Performance Results Act as an example. But as your question suggested, it's more about trying to improve outcomes and to make the resource allocation process somehow or other connected with performance and outcomes than simply efficiency.
Yeah, what I had in mind was, correct me if I'm wrong, I think New Zealand has this where
Right.
they,
Right.
for example, they would have they would budget on the outcome of, let's say, infant mortality rate, and they would say the current rate is this, and we would like to reduce it in the next 1 year or next 5 years to a certain
Mhm.
level. Now, there are various factors that affect the IMR.
Mhm.
It could be a function related to the health department. It could also be a function related to education department. It could also be a function related to drinking water.
Sure.
And so various agencies would get a proportion of the budget allocated to reduction in IMR.
Mhm.
Rather than a program being specific to a particular department or an agency,
Mhm. Mhm.
the outcome where the various programs of all the departments which affect that particular outcome
Mhm.
get a proportion of the budget which is earmarked for that.
Yes. 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 Yes, you are correct that that's what was attempted and attempted to be implemented. Have we adopted that approach in the United States? Not nearly to the same degree. Almost all of our sort of performance evaluation work has been within the context of individual agencies and in individual departments. And as you'll see here in this fairly dense slide that probably violates every canon of PowerPoint presentations, it lists in the first bullet the various approaches in the 20th century that we have used, and in the second, it essentially argues that that administrative reforms such as program budgeting have to be careful of not overburdening the budget process to the point where it becomes dysfunctional. And we have a number of examples where that happened. The early days with zero-based budgeting in the United States overburdened the budget process to the point where it was fairly quickly abandoned in most places where it was tried. But the third bullet there is one that I would want to emphasize, and that is to say that at both the national and state level, research by many of my colleagues have concluded that performance measures tend to be used more effectively to make managerial programmatic decisions. But where they have been less effective is in budgetary resource allocation decisions. That's not a reason to abandon performance measurement, but it is to say it's important to be realistic about how likely it is to penetrate the budget process where resource allocations decisions get made. And so what we don't want to have happen is to introduce a performance system on top of a budget system, have it overburden the budget system, immediately fail and conclude that performance measurement doesn't work. Because performance measurement has been quite beneficial, but I think it's been more beneficial to managers to make judgments about program effectiveness, and it's been somewhat less beneficial in resource allocation. Now that's a pretty broad generalization, but I think I'd stand by it. How am I doing on time? Okay. The sixth proposition is that a public budget is a method of regulating aggregate economic demand through taxing and spending decisions. And what I mean by that is to say that here taxing and spending decisions are not only about purchasing goods and services and acquiring revenue. They surely are about that. But in addition to that, they are about attempting to smooth fluctuations in the business cycle in a countercyclical way so as to increase the stability in the business cycle. And this is to say that the stabilization function, if you will, is primarily a function of the national government. State governments don't do it very well. Local governments probably almost not at all insofar as this is concerned. And then I would just add, to make sure that you know that I'm not forgetting this subject, that the monetary activity of our central bank also contributes a great deal to economic stabilization. But I don't think about the role of the central bank so much as being a budgetary function, and I wanted to limit the conversation today to being primarily about budgets. So here are some examples. To many of you guys, these ought to be very familiar examples, and I think they're all about leadership. Anybody know what the Economic Recovery Act of 1981 did? This was in the administration of President Ronald Reagan, and probably the sort of single thing that most people would remember about it is that it changed the bracket structure of the U.S. graduated income tax. The top bracket prior to that legislation was at 70%. And it led to a decline in the top bracket that by the time we got to 1993 had been down to 36%. And that ought to be a clue. What did the Revenue Reconciliation Act of '93 do? Slightly. Remember how? No? The so-called quarter millionaires tax, a proposal in the '93 Act that for incomes 250,000 or more, there would be a 10% surcharge, and so a new bracket was created that went from 36 to 39.6%. Those in the second category are decisions that occurred in the George W. Bush administration. The 2001 Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act. That's the Bush tax cuts that were enacted in 2001 that were presumed to have a stimulus effect. But they also took place in a climate in which the president had encouraged or had inherited a surplus. That's the end of that 8 years of the Clinton era. He had a surplus. As a good Republican, it was important to demonstrate his bona fides by proposing tax reductions. Could afford it because we had a surplus. And it was thought, at least philosophically, that it would have a stimulus effect on the economy. A major characteristic of those tax cuts, of course, is that they were temporary. And that if they were not made permanent, they would expire at the end of 10 years. The Jobs Growth and Tax Reconciliation Act was sort of a follow-up, an attempt to achieve some of the things that they weren't able to get in the compromise of 2001, but both of them are tax cuts of the Bush administration. As the economy appeared to be slowing down and dark clouds were emerging, in 2008, in February of 2008, Congress passed, at the recommendation of the President, the Economic Stimulus Act. Some of us got cash checks as tax rebates. Some of us, speaking loosely, got tax rebates. because it turns out not to have been enough. And in the fall of 2008, we have the theater of Senator Obama of Illinois and Senator McCain rushing home off the campaign trail to Washington to advise the president about what should happen with a declining stock market and a fractured economy. And President Bush signed the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008. One of the core elements of it was the famous TARP program, Temporary Relief Program. Countercyclical finance, clearly having the effect of increasing the size of the deficit. And then in 2009, a new president has to decide what to do about trying to stimulate the economy as the worst of the recession is starting to be over. And the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, signed by President Obama, clearly contributed to increasing the national debt, because if you're going to engage in countercyclical finance and it is going to involve deficit spending, of course it's going to increase the size of the debt. And then in 2010, another piece of legislation that temporarily gave relief from the unemployment insurance that individuals had to pay from 6.2% to 4.2% for a period of 2 years. And then in 2011, the Budget Control Act that set the stage for sequestration. The Congress decided that it would require itself to make economic relief decisions with consequences so horrific they couldn't possibly let those consequences happen. But they did. And then in January of 2013, the American Taxpayer Relief Act of 2012, this was the bill that made the Bush tax cuts of 2001 permanent, except for the highest income categories that reverted to the pre-2001 period. If this is not about leadership, I don't know what leadership is. But it's clearly an example of presidents using the budget, using the government's taxing and spending decisions to try to influence public policy. And so, for me at least, these 6 ways of thinking about a budget represent a way for me to understand what it is. If it works for you, I'm pleased. If not, I regret. But let me stop at this point, I think, and ask what your questions or comments or dissents or disagreements might be for as long as we have. So. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, it seems as though the budget, you were addressing the budget issue here. It's not the fact that we misuse budgets potentially or misallocate funds. It seems as though we have more of a spending problem within our country. We overspend, I think, potentially more than what we budget for.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see, or what is your opinion on how law or legal ways of implementing or affecting that spending issue within our budgetary environment?
Yeah. I'm not sure that it's true that we always overspend. I mean, I think there are differences across the country. I live in a state, for example, where the state almost never overspends. Our state central budget office monitors revenue collections. And whenever, using a sort of a 3-month moving average, it appears as though the revenue collections are not robust enough to meet the projected spending, the governor will immediately direct state agencies to withhold some of their authorized spending, such that the budget immediately goes back into balance. That's not the way it works in all 50 states. Probably the worst extreme, you know, or sort of at the other end of that, would be a state that you know, decides to stop paying its bills because it has spent more than its revenue that is collected. But part of it is, I think, for leaders to accurately perceive what the culture is in their respective states with regard to how much out of balance will be tolerated politically before they get punished at the next election. And so that, you know, in a fiscally conservative state like Georgia, where I live, leaders understand that they would be punished at the ballot box if it was generally thought that the budget was out of balance. That's apparently not true in a place like Illinois, where, you know, there's a period where there's not that's the same kind of concern. It also has something to do with the appetite of voters for services. People want the snow removed. They want the holes in the highways fixed. They want farmers to be able to get their goods to market. They want health care. They want quality education for their kids. And all that's pretty expensive. They don't want to pay a level of taxation that is sufficient to do that in a balanced manner. And in the states, you have to come closer to doing that. At the national level, you don't. Now, you know, as I said earlier, we probably are intolerant about the size of the deficit and the debt that we had in 2010, 11, and 12. But I don't think we're intolerant about having a deficit or about having a national debt. It's a matter of sort of where the tipping point is. And I think it will not happen in my lifetime, and I don't think it'll happen in your lifetime, for us to ever require the national government legally to balance its budget. It'll be a goal, it'll be an aspiration, there'll be political pressures to do better than we are currently doing, but I don't think we will ever put that kind of constraint on it. State and local governments have a long history, many states at least, where the culture says, you know, if that budget gets out of balance, we'll punish you politically the next time around. So I think there's not a single straightforward answer to your question. It sort of, it depends. It would be what I would say about it. Yes, sir.
So I'm from Ukraine. I'm not familiar with U.S. budget system. Could you please briefly explain the difference between state budget and the federal budget? So you just told that Georgia does not overspend. So what's this threshold between the state and federal budget?
Well, you know, it's a federal system, as you probably know, and the 50 states each have their own apparatus of government. They have their own legislative branches and executive branches, their own taxing sources. They get some money from the federal government through an intergovernmental grant and aid process. But I think, to speak directly to this question, there are regional differences across the country. Some of them are historic, some of them are cultural, of the kinds of people that live there and what their belief systems are. And in a state like I described, where there's a strong pressure to have a balanced budget, I think it's not simply that the law says you have to have a balanced budget. That's an important factor. But that the participants in the process believe it should be balanced. The people think it ought to be balanced, and elected leaders think it ought to be balanced. So they do what they need to do to keep it balanced. At the national level, there's a perception that the federal government has as one of its missions and responsibilities to engage in counter-cyclical activity to try to smooth out sort of extreme fluctuations in the business cycle, and that it can do it through taxing and spending. And I think that's you know, some conservatives would argue that it shouldn't be that way. Some liberals would argue that it ought to be more energetic. But I think there's a general view that it's a legitimate activity and that it's an appropriate activity within some range of tolerance on both the left and the right side for it. Okay. Yes, sir.
So I have a comment. The example you gave about the 5% proposal of what would be cuttable,
Right.
what would be able to be cut from each agency. The organization I came from attempted 2 iterations of that, 2 very different strategies in both iterations. The first iteration, it was exactly as you described, but what we found was exactly what you kind of highlighted. 2/3 of the money was allowed to stay with the organization, and that continued to go up. And when we dug deeper and did the analysis, what we saw was it wasn't the bottom priority that was being put up to be cut. It was that second tier priority that would be such a detriment to the organization or whatever their service they were providing that it could not be cut.
So the participants gamed the system.
They gamed the system. So then the following year, with the second iteration, it was a flat cut that was taken, and then the youth were subsequently submitted, you know, giving leadership an opportunity to say, not knowing whether or not the money was coming back at all, and then really getting a true idea of what could be cut, what could be taken, how it could be redistributed. And so I was just wondering, based on the numbers that you saw.
None of that surprises me. It's very rational behavior on the part of participants in the process that are committed to protecting the funding for their program. I mean, I wouldn't want an agency head who didn't think that his or her program was the most important program in the government and was willing to fight like hell to try to protect the funding for that program. If you had an agency head that didn't think about it that way, you got to get a new agency head. But by the same token, the budget process has to be able to deal with that. The other thing that happens with this system, you know, the analogy I oftentimes like to use is with a wet towel. You get a towel and you start twisting and squeezing it, you start getting water, you get water out of it the first couple of twists. But at some point, you're not getting anything more out of it. And so I think this system, after maybe a 3rd year or 4th year, isn't going to yield nearly the same kinds of results. And so, you know, from a budgetary perspective, a management perspective, you back off of it for a couple of years until enough slack begins to build up within the system, and then you impose it again. Would be a more sensible kind of financial management approach, I think. Yeah. Yes, sir. Or yes, ma'am.
So thank you very much for knowledge sharing. Regard with the balanced budget, this is reasonable for the developed countries. But for us, for the developing countries, we have a lot of to improve the infrastructure or to increase the economic development. Our country usage is very high. So how can we to match with the balanced budget?
Yeah.
For
So,
the developing countries?
sure. So the argument that you're making is that the mismatch between spending needs and resource availability is far greater than the situations that I'm describing. And the answer to that is yes. I mean, I understand that that's what it is. And I think this isn't going to change immediately. It has to be done gradually. There has to be a gradual acceptance of a taxation system, a revenue claiming system that is realistic for what the citizenry can reasonably be expected to contribute, and an expectation about spending that is realistic about what the country can reasonably be expected to afford. The political problem, the leadership problem, is trying to manage the pent-up demand for expenditures so that it doesn't overtake the ability of the leadership to install a modernized system of taxation and a modernized system of spending that moves in the direction of the accomplishments. And so, I mean, I think that's an example where leadership is crucial to be able to communicate to citizens, I understand your problem, and here's the plan to fix it. It won't be fixed overnight, but we are making incremental steps on the revenue side and on the spending side, and here's the evidence that we're having some success. That's an enormous challenge for a leader in a developing country. I understand that. It won't happen quickly, but I think, you know, skilled leaders like yourself, you know, can understand these issues, can make those kinds of cases. But I understand what you're talking about. Yes, sir.
You were mentioning about the, you know, lots of things depend on good leadership things.
Mm-hmm.
As we know, the leadership changes over time. You know, one leader is here dealing with some only urgent tasks and taking care of whatever necessary, but later, when another leader comes, but sometimes the new leader will be challenged with some taking steps of the previous leader.
Sure.
You know?
Sure.
So what my question is, it's about the fairness of decisions made. For example, there are countries in the world now who are facing, let's say, like aging problem, and at the same time diminished labor force because of reduction in the births, or you know, being more labor force increase. But in this kind of situation, like those kind of, for example, Japan, they are now growing. Life expectancy is very long, longer than before, but the birth rate is low, and as a result, labor force is getting low. But you know, social part of the budget is becoming more burden to the state budget. But where should be this line of justice here, while this more tax should be paid by the labor force to cover the social burden?
You're not going to expect me to give you a specific number, are you?
What I mean is not in figures, but this is kind of long-term.
Sure,
change.
it is. Change, but you're not talking just about change in leadership. You're talking about change in demographic trends and.
Well, my question is about where should be, because the people who are now in the labor force must pay more taxes.
Sure.
But when they grow up, when they need to get the same kind of benefit from tax, the situation might be different.
It could be.
Where is the justice part?
It could be. And that's as you phrase it, that's a problem that's very similar to a problem that we're facing in the United States with regard to, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I tell my students that in order to fix the Social Security system, they need to be more productive. They need to increase the size of the population that will support them in their days. These are tough intergenerational issues, and as I said, there's not a specific number as to where the balance ought to be on that. But I think leaders need to understand the problem, come up with some kind of reasonable plan, and to effectively articulate that plan. What we hope is that when there is a transition in leadership, that it's not a transition to a set of leaders that are fundamentally different philosophically than the previous leaders. That to the extent that the leadership cadre gets chosen out of some range of policy preferences in the middle of a continuum, you would then expect less severe departures from the previous leadership. And that's, I mean, I understand the problem. The solution is very difficult to that problem. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Still talking about budget balancing, I can't get my mind around the United States, the federal government of the United States balancing the budget.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that because, well, I get the impression that a budget deficit for the United States is actually a market. There's an international market for it.
Mm-hmm. That's
for
true.
a budget deficit of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's an international market for it, then balancing the budget actually deprives the rest of the world of trade.
Right. That's
So, I mean, if it does that, then, I mean, there's a strong argument for the United
Sure.
States to continue to
yeah.
create a
That's probably not the reason why we do it. But surely that's one of the consequences, and it's not so much the deficit as it is the debt. It's to the extent that a large portion of the debt is held by foreign entities, which creates not only a financial problem, but it creates a foreign policy kind of problem potentially. But I don't think that you would find very many of our leaders that would argue that that's why we ought to maintain a high debt, is because we're contributing to financing foreign markets. But that's one of the consequences of it, and that's one of the fears of having a debt that is so large. As I mentioned, the figures, we're faced with a debt as a percentage of GDP that's sort of in the 75% range. It wasn't very long ago that debt as a percentage of GDP was around 33%. That's a big change, and that's a scary change. Doesn't mean there shouldn't be a debt, but it's the magnitude of it. And what comparing it with GDP essentially talks about the capacity to bear the burden. We need to move to reducing the debt. You reduce it over time by reducing the deficit, also by growing the GDP, which changes the denominator, we're moving in that direction. But it would be an unfortunate perception of reality to take a snapshot of fiscal 8, 9, 10, and 11 as being the norm, because that was not the norm. As I said, we had from the onset of the Clinton years, 8 consecutive years where the size of the deficit decreased, and in fact, moving into the Bush administration in the first 2 years, the deficit actually turned into a surplus. And that's what gave the president a comfort zone to propose tax cuts in 2001. Yeah. Yes, sir.
In the Clinton years, wasn't the reality that there wasn't a budget surplus that they used accounting tricks to make?
I'm sorry, I missed your.
During the Clinton administration,
Right.
they used the Social Security surplus to add to erase the debt. The debt still existed. America's never been out of debt since the country was formed.
Well, yeah, the point that you're raising is that is a distinction we typically make between on budget and off budget. The surplus in the Social Security fund, in its current iteration, it goes back to about 1983 when we changed the way in which we have structured the Social Security system, and the Social Security fund has been running in surplus since about 1983. In recent years, the size of that surplus is getting smaller, but it has always been used to offset the difference between spending and revenue so as to make the size of the deficit somewhat smaller. Now, it's not a trick. I mean, people that do what I do and most of the policy analysts in this building understand that completely. Understand how that works. One of the consequences of what you're talking about is that as the size of the Social Security surplus gets depleted, two things would happen. One, we would have to start paying benefits out of out of annual revenue streams, but also it would not be there for bookkeeping purposes, at least, to make the size of the deficit look smaller. But you're right about the general point. That's exactly what we have done. It's not that Clinton used it to trick people. It's just that that's how that's just how we present that information. If you look at the historical tables in the U.S. budget, you'll see two categories: on budget and off budget. And if the size of the deficit on budget is different from the size of the deficit off budget when you take into account the Social Security Trust Fund. Yeah, Social Security is not the only thing that's used for that, but it's overwhelming the largest portion of it. Yeah.
All right. Now, after this, we will have another occasion for you to interact further with Dr. Lauth. Our staff has prepared some food and drink for kind of reception. Now, as what Dr. Lauth has presented here to you today is a very brief and extended summary of his lifelong research about public finance and public budgeting in the 6 lessons. So, as an appreciation of his lecture today, we have prepared two things for Dr. Lauth. One is a certificate of appreciation. It reads, "In gratitude for your dedication to our executive education students and their pursuits seeking the ideals of leadership in the public sector and NGOs." That's you. All right. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And to go with that, we have here at Maxwell a tradition that's the senior oaths. This is a souvenir to Dr. Lauth. He knows this very well. It also serves to remind us, every one of us here, in particular you, that our job, our mission of coming to Maxwell is to take over what was given or was placed in our hands. We make it better, stronger, and hand it down to our successors and the next generation. All right? Dr. Lauth.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. Please stay for the reception, and you can further interact with Dr. Lauth.
Let me just say how much I appreciate your allowing me to come here today and to talk with you. This is a very distinguished institution. I have great affection for the Maxwell School, and I wish you well in your careers. And thanks so much for giving me your time and attention. Good luck to you.